Alrighty. How's it going, party people? So today we rolled up page 167, which actually has 4 creatures on it because it's the page that just lists all the golems. So we rolled the d4 and we ended up with the last one, Stone Golem, which I think will be pretty fun because it has a lot of different angles that you can take on it. Honestly, I'm not going to hate on the art in the D&D book because obviously all of it's way better than my stuff. But the pick in the book for Stone Golem, I find a little bit lacking. It's a little stanky. It's kind of got this like Mega Man vibe to it. I don't know. I'm just not totally feeling it. It's like it's very stiff. It's very robotic, which is probably part of the design brief and part of how you want to think about these things moving. But given the range of quality and gestural and sort of like figurative quality in ancient statues, you could actually go quite a few different places with this. So the things that I was kind of thinking of, sort of in a generic way, because the description in the monster manual for Stone Golem is pretty sparse. But if you kind of think about it generically, it's like typically a neutral kind of like construct, usually in the employ of a wizard or perhaps a guardian at a temple or a castle or ruins or something like that. And that's I think the direction that I want to go with it is sort of this like guardian type figure. And I was kind of thinking, since the first two creatures that we've done, the Frost Giant and the Mummy Lord, have sort of been male, then we could try something in sort of like go with a kind of female figure for this Stone Golem, which I think is, probably the lesser expected gender to go with on this. All of the golems in the monster manual are kind of like male-ish or male presenting, so I figured we could go with kind of like an Athena-like warrior priestess sort of vibe for this one, with a cool helmet or headdress, maybe overgrown with moss or vines or ivy. I kind of am envisioning something that's a little more, as opposed to like outwardly evil or openly presenting as an enemy that you'd have to fight in a D&D setting. Rather kind of go with something a little more neutral, or not even nature based, but at harmony with the surrounding environment. Thinking like a big spear and shield, kind of to evoke that Athena vibe, and then overgrown with mosses, vines, ivy, and maybe even like some flowers or something. I'm kind of thinking of like the Arthurian legends that like Hellboy draws from, where when he bleeds, like lilies sprout up or something like that. So have some kind of design element like that incorporated into the overall design. So hence I've gone with kind of a green color for these sketches, kind of a greenish. Maybe we'll get some more gray in there, just to give them more of that stone vibe, and kind of go from there. So let's see what we can do with this Stone Golem. I am on another layer here. And, yeah. So definitely want some kind of cool, like, I'm almost thinking something with a kind of Indian inspiration as well, since there's so much, amazing Indian sculpture work depicting all kinds of different female goddesses and things like that. To kind of go with something sort of that nature. Ooh, I do have the Mummy Lord too. So the Mummy Lord did have kind of a interesting headdress as well that I've sort of like been working on. Mummy Lord not in a completed state yet, but that's what he looks like so far. And there's elements of him that I like, and things that I'm not super satisfied with yet. But it's a work in progress, and we'll keep on trucking away on it. And hopefully have a neat finished illustration out of that fella by the end of maybe next week. So with the Stone Golem, back to her. Maybe something with kind of this like pointed hat and some sort of like textured elements. I might be getting too deep into the details already, but I kind of like the idea of doing some kind of textured headdress, kind of evoking very old forms of stone sculpture. And kind of those gray, stoic eyes. I actually probably should have gone, and maybe I'll do this on the next sketch, but gone with the gesture first on this one. I did pull up some reference, but I'm not really using it so much as just I've got it kind of in the back of my mind as I'm going, and then once we knock out a couple of these sketches, using that for the refinement phase. That's, I think, an interesting way to go as well with like a stone figure, is using some of that drapery, kind of like toga-like situation. Yeah, I definitely think if we want to evoke that kind of like Greek or Roman statuary vibe, then we need to work on the gesture a little bit more. I think I'm working a little too big as well. I think I need to zoom out a little here, because I was really excited to get in on the head and kind of like start playing around with sort of the gestural qualities that we might be able to evoke there. And we want to, I think, since I'm kind of going with more of an illustrative approach than a kind of like explicitly design approach with these, we do want to give that feeling of height, and so maybe ultimately have a sort of like bottom up kind of view where the statue is sort of like has sort of like a downward look. And I think, especially if we're kind of like evoking kind of an Athena or like a warrior goddess situation, that might be preferable, because it is kind of like a looking down on your enemies and smiting them kind of thing. Athena, not evil, but certainly not, without her kind of wrathful elements, and I think that could be kind of cool to play with for a golem made in the honor of a figure like that, or housing the spirit of one of her priests or priestesses, something like that kind of vibe. I don't know if a lot of people utilize the historical pantheons that they have because they do list them out in the player's handbook. Like if you want to be an adherent of historical Egyptian or Greek or Norse god, they do list them out for you in the player's handbook, so it is an option. I don't know how I feel about that armor, and I'm definitely already countering a situation where the headdress kind of clashes with what's going on down below. And definitely though, I think sandals, and maybe the pedestal. I think whatever pedestal they are on has to be incorporated into the design somehow. Just kind of scribbling in some potential kind of design elements for the shield. Nothing nothing final yet, of course. Okay. Well, that's a little attempt. Not loving it. I think I need to get a little more general, a little more flowy with some of the shapes. Let's see if we can at least begin with that kind of downcast element right from the start. Downcast gaze, I should say. And get a little more of that kind of an understanding of where how the torso is functioning in this, and that'll give us an idea of where we go with the rest of the figure. Arms are a little thick on that one. You don't need to be buff to evoke power, but maybe we do make her a little bit on the chunkier side to evoke that golem element. Because there is, if we're kind of returning to the design brief that's sort of laid out for us by just like the nature of what this monster is, if we're trying to evoke Golem is perhaps distinct from just living statue, right? Statue that is animated. Golem has connotations that, of course, give you a certain image in mind. And we're trying to kind of break that expectation a little bit, but it also is fine to sort of play with what we're handed. That being said, I'm not terribly interested in drawing a blocky, robotic kind of golem figure. I have her helmet, so if her helmet's like that. Might be worthwhile just to do a straight up like just page of helmets or something, headdresses. Just so we don't get bogged down in that too much. So in this one we have kind of the spear kind of pointed down. I got a little bit of a late start today. I'm already like, God damn, like, because that frost giant was, to get it to the state that it was, finished in, was a pretty big effort. It's not usual that I kind of like will do all the steps in the process in kind of like one fell swoop. I'll usually like do the sketch, and then I'll ink it, and then I'll kind of lose steam on it, come back to it later, refine it a little bit, and then start doing the colors and stuff if I'm satisfied with that. So because of the kind of challenge I've set for myself, I'm trying to get these done in a more timely fashion, obviously. But, I say done, but really I just mean like in a state that I'm satisfied with them. They don't have to be finished per se. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm more of a diagonal on this spear. Maybe make the shaft a little bit thicker on the spear just to evoke that stone form kind of thing. Some kind of circular shield, maybe like a chunk of it is cracked off. Again, we can do to make that the stone element kind of like evoke that in the overall design. There's one thing, I'm trying to get better at is, or rather, not even trying to get better at, but one thing I want to avoid becoming a bad habit is kind of that, we'll fix it in post mentality, right? It's like, it looks like just a person now, because if we want to make it look like a stone statue, we can do that in the rendering step when we color it and add texture and all that stuff. But that is probably, it's just like the earlier you solve the kinds of problems that are going to keep your piece from reading the way you want it to, the better end result you're going to get and the less work you'll have to do to kind of like make up for the elements that aren't working in your piece, right? So like these challenges I think are nice to do every once in a while. I might keep this one going, honestly, but not on as strict a schedule. Just because you can get really bogged down in trying to hammer out all of these pieces on the regular, Definitely neither of these so far are really calling out to me in the way that Mummy Lord guy did yesterday. And I think that's because, I think it's for a couple of reasons. But, yeah, these sketches just don't have that pizzazz. And I think the less human the monster is, especially, honestly, like weirdly, the more gestural I feel like I can get with it, the less rigid. And I think the fact that, again, we're trying to make this stone, maybe that is the approach with this one. Really get the gestural element down, and then as it stiffens up over the course of rendering, that is going to naturally kind of bring it into more of that golem-like feel. But I don't know. I don't know if we rely on that. I don't know if we need to. And coming back and looking at this one, I don't mind it necessarily. I think if the form of the headdress was a little more defined, that might help me think about whether I actually like this or not. Kind of that rounded form of the front. Kind of looks like she's wearing a dunce cap, doesn't it? Definitely not the look we're going for. Maybe we remove that thing at the top and we just make that kind of like a... That might look worse. I don't mind that. Kind of going for that almost like Triceratops crest sort of look. I don't hate that at all. Maybe not get too bogged down in the weeds on that right now, but I'm not hating that. I kind of like that. This one, I think I'm just having to think about more as I draw it. And this is one of those things where, with this whole streaming element of this, I'm definitely not as comfortable with it. And that's why I haven't been doing certain parts of these drawings on stream, because I'm just not... I'm like barely versed enough to to draw and talk at the same time. I can make it hard, you know. Obviously, there are people who are really good at drawing and talking at the same time. Anybody who's here will probably be familiar with Stephen Zapata. I did a mentorship with him, gosh, like 2 years ago now, basically. It was in 2021, the summer of 2021, so coming on 2 years. And one of the things that sticks with me is, there's obviously so many different ways that a drawing can go wrong, right? There's so many ways that you can screw up, and those things generally don't matter because they can be corrected, right? Even if that correction is just that you have to start over. But I remember him telling us that the only absolutely wrong decision is the one that stops you from drawing at all, right? The one that stops you from continuing the project or starting a new project or, finishing a project. Whatever is preventing you from finishing, whatever choice that you're making that stops you from continuing the work, whatever choice you make that, whatever mindset you take on that prevents you from making the thing, that was the wrong choice. That was the wrong choice for the piece. Like it's like tautological, but it also it gives you an out when you're frozen. When you're frozen on how to continue with a piece, you just say, well, obviously, like whatever's happening right now, I'm clearly overthinking. I'm overthinking this. And overthinking it has stopped my progress, and so I just need to stop thinking about it. I just need to stop thinking the things that are, making me not work. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, and that's because I'm trying to split my mind in a couple different places at once. But it's also just it's a concept that is brutally simple, and yet because it's brutally simple, it sounds like kind of dumb. It's almost like, well, how is that different from saying just do the work? And the difference is that, at least as I remember hearing it, as I interpreted it from Stephen, the difference is that in that context, he was, sort of saying like, well, there are all these different choices you have to make throughout the process of completing a piece of art, right? And if you get hung up on every single possible way that things could go wrong, that's not going to be helpful to you most of the time. Obviously, it's like every artist is different, and some people, just like their sheer neuroticism is going to yield amazing work. And you can't really fault them for that. But the more often than not, rather than yielding amazing work, that neuroticism will just stop people in their tracks. It will stop them from completing amazing work, or anything at all, any work. And that is the enemy, right? That is ultimately the thing that we're all trying to fight against as artists. The abyss, nothingness. Kind of like the idea of like a kneeling statue. I'm going to draw through just so I can kind of understand the pose here. And then the kind of drapery is sort of like draped at the side. I got to shrank this chick down a little bit. Jeez. That's what happens when you try and draw and philosophize at the same time if you're not, an expert. It's dangerous stuff. TBH. This armor is a little too medieval. It's definitely too medieval. I think I like the direction of this pose, but I do not like the design of the armor as much. What I might even do is give her kind of like baggy pants and some kind of sort of rounded knee brace and like some kind of cool design elements on the shins there. And we'll keep her in sandals. It's kind of like Achilles, like kind of Greek-Roman style sandals, but the pants I feel like have more of an Indian or almost like Ottoman kind of vibe. And maybe get some inspiration for the breastplate from that kind of more Greek or Roman style as well, or maybe go to a sort of like Eastern design for that too. I'm trying to remember what I was thinking for this pose. I was like, do I want to give her a sword that's like the idea of like a big nasty curved sword too. Something that really has some heft to it, like you can bring it down like a hammer. And I know I said earlier I want to try and avoid that fix it in post kind of mentality, but it's definitely how I'm feeling. Like, I like this pose. This is something I was kind of trying to communicate yesterday is like, when it comes to designing these monsters, and they are like characters, right? It's like there's not really a distinction there with, creature and character design sometimes. It's that the pose does so much to communicate the kind of attitude and the character of the creature, right? It does so much to communicate the personality, what their role is in the context of a party, or in the context of a story, or in the context of a dungeon. In this case, if we're thinking Dungeons and Dragons, like having a good pose gives you a lot of mileage. And it's a thing that I'm finding with these, and something I've noticed when I've been trying to do kind of like characters from scratch for portfolios and other things. Something that I've noticed is if I don't design them in a pose, they don't have enough life for me to like want to continue drawing them. So it is like kind of detrimental from a... It's like, oh, well, ideally, you'd want to be able to see all the elements of their costume, and, if you're thinking about it as like a designing for entertainment or some kind of industry standard, you don't necessarily want something like this, where elements of their costume and everything would be obscured just based on how they're standing and how they're positioned. But again, returning to that, like, what are the choices that are going to make you want to continue? This feels like one of those. And, once you discover that, you find, like, okay, well, in fact, it's more important that I just, like, finish the piece, right? It's more important that I just keep going. And so, with that in mind, it's more important that we get this part done, and then if we feel like it's worthy of that kind of full spread, book page kind of like treatment with multiple poses, different angles, figuring out the character that way, then you can kind of go in and do that. So it depends on what your purpose is, because my ultimate goal with a lot of these drawings is to turn them into illustrations that I can use for my own products that I'm making, and those are going to include some kind of like mini D&D manuals. They're going to include, just kind of like little fun character quests and side stories and stuff like that. Kind of a plug and play thing for Dungeons and Dragons. So, with that in mind, they don't have to be perfect. And they don't have to perfectly kind of show off all the potential elements. Because you think about, like, well, you're designing for a video game. Well, then somebody needs to be able to see everything on the character so they can render that character. And even then, there's considerations of, like, well, is this game isometric? Because if it's isometric, or if it's like, is it a first-person shooter? Is it like a behind, are you... is it a third person, but you're locked behind the character's back? Then you need to have, a really interesting costume elements also on the back of the character. And so there's all these considerations, generally speaking. Yeah, I think one thing that, so D&D is a kind of generic fantasy setting, generic medieval fantasy. So you see a lot of characters that have elements of like knight's armor and things like that. Your classic medieval European knight, that is. And they incorporate stuff from other cultures, but I think it's just like less familiar to the Western audience, like what era they would be from, what culture, But you can kind of utilize that, I feel like, in the context of a Dungeons and Dragons sort of setting or a medieval setting to make things feel really old. You give them kind of this like alien quality to them by placing them outside of that standard era. And that is, I think, kind of an interesting consideration, because you got to think like, well, most fantasy stories don't, or most fantasy like video games don't like really take that into account per se. Like many do. I won't say like most don't. But like a lot of times you'll encounter like, it's like, oh, this old statue, but it looks like the armor is still from the era that the characters are like currently playing in, right? Kind of like these being like some of this being the helmet and the headdress, and some of it being like hair, right? I think that's kind of fun. And the thing is, like, I'm not too married to the notion of these like ultimately being exactly what exactly the creatures or the monsters or the characters that they're described as being in the monster manual. I'm not totally married to that, but I think it kind of defeats the purpose of the challenge if I sort of stray too far from those elements. I think it's kind of fun that way, and I think I want it to be close enough that people will say, oh, that is a cool take on XYZ creature. That it'll be recognizable in that context, in that D&D context. That's kind of the goal. It's like, okay, well, that is a stone golem, yes, but it is a unique enough stone golem that if I drop this into my campaign, people will be like, okay, that is a cool take on a stone golem, right? That's the idea. I'm going a little crazy with this helmet. I like this area here. And definitely like just kind of like big shapes to indicate the eyes and stuff. Kind of shadowy elements. And I don't know if I love the shoulder pad either, but it's just kind of what we got. The other thing is like, so this is another kind of principle of design that you can snatch up from, like Michelangelo's David or old, especially giant sculptures of that ilk, inspired by the Romans and Greeks, or part of that Renaissance era. Is you can get away with, well, the hands and feet end up really big, and so do the heads. I actually should probably make her head bigger, and that I'm trying to remember what the technical reason for that is, besides establishing more heroic proportions, but it also has to do with kind of perspective and obviously the head and the hands, and to a lesser degree the feet, unless you're into that kind of thing, to a lesser degree, all of those elements are like focal point. They're natural focal points, and they're natural focal points because those are the things that humans pay attention to when they communicate, right? Especially the head and the hands. I remember, so James Gurney. I went to a talk with him, and he's talked about this in other contexts, and many other artists have as well. But this is the last place I heard about it. It's those studies where they track people's eyes as they look at pieces of art, and there's the whole idea about like the golden ratio and like certain styles of composition that are like the ideal perspectives and things that draw your eye. And most of the time, if there was a human in the piece, they would be looking at the eyes of that human. They'd be looking at the heads. They'd be looking at the hands. Those are the kind of things that attracted their attention. And that's just that seems kind of like trivially obvious. And the impression I got was that James Gurney just kind of took that information and was like, okay, well, I think what he said was, okay, well, I'll focus on making my like heads really good, which I think is a funny, another, again, like just a very like, okay, duh, kind of reaction to that information, but it makes a lot of sense. It's like, that's one approach. I think the other approach is like, well, people are going to look where they're going to look. Maybe I shouldn't focus so much on that. In terms of like making the drawing effective. I think that that's one thing. Like composition obviously is super important, but it's a thing that's kind of nebulous to learn, and it's not something that I am terribly well versed in because I'm often drawing these like lone figures kind of standing out in the middle of nowhere, and then and then maybe adding stuff in the background later, if I feel like it, Okay, well, I definitely like this one best so far. And I like her just like on like a sheer block. Something very simple, geometric, and kind of like brutalist. It's kind of like cracked, and it's got like moss and stuff growing up the sides. And then the other thing to think about too, again, because we are designing with D&D in mind. Okay, now what are some opportunities to toss in some stuff that characters would want to interact with, right? And so, yeah, big fat crystal maybe or something in the center of the shield. It's like, ooh, that looks like a juicy piece of loot. Maybe I want that. Maybe a character would be interested in having some of these jewels or something like that. Again, I also like the idea of this. Her being like totally made of stone. But there's those considerations. There's like obviously depending on the context in which you encountered a giant statue like this, as a player character, you'd be enticed to check it out. Regardless, because it might be the only point of interest that's described. And certainly, like, if you were in kind of like jungle setting and you see anything that's crafted by sentient hands, that is cause for interest. And in this case, perhaps doubly so because of the kind of nature of this form, right? She is a warrior, and that is interesting in and of itself because D&D is based on, kind of this like warrior aesthetic. These, I was just kind of like trying to make these stone. These just look like boobs. I'm gonna have to. Yeah. Let's fix that. Let's fix that right now. I just like the idea of doing something with like these kind of circular plates, as opposed to a kind of more traditional. What do you call it? Like a pauldron, And I don't know if that necessarily works. That might be competing. There might be a little too much resonance with the shield and not enough resonance with the helmet. So I'll have to give that some thought. But I do like the idea of maybe almost like a tortoise shell sort of thing. Something that still borrows from the aesthetics of the headdress that we kind of have going on here. Which again, those are also kind of improvised, so there's no reason we couldn't change the headdress up too. Okay, I'm not hating this. I'm not hating this last one. And for the most part, I've kind of worked on these sketches for about an hour before being like, okay, I'm tired of streaming and I'm hungry. But I had a big, giant bowl of rice with some leftover chickpeas and pork and some other stuff. So I'm fueled up, but I am still like, I was still drawing all morning trying to work out the deets on this Mummy Lord fella. And I gotta say, I think, again, what I was referencing earlier with the pose, there are elements of this pose that I like, and there are elements that just kind of feel like generic. Like, he doesn't feel like a Mummy Lord. Like, I think he still fits the bill for the monster. Like, if you encountered this mummy, you'd be like, okay, this is not just a regular mummy, right? It's like he's got a little swag to him. He's got some drip, and that means that he's more than your average mummy. But he's maybe more of like a mummy high priest than a mummy lord. Which to be fair, I don't mind that. I actually there are parts of this I like, but I think like if he were on a throne, or if he were like rising out of a sarcophagus, or if he were standing in a more kind of like upright position, whereas right now he is doing a little bit of a zombie shuffle, and that doesn't dovetail exactly with like Mummy Lord. But that's okay. I still like this guy. I still think this is probably a stronger design than the Frost Giant. But it's not a competition. If these, I actually don't know. I didn't really read the stat block on the Mummy Lord versus the Frost Giant. I'm not sure which would actually end up winning in a fight. I can tell you that the Stone Golem has several attributes, such as immutable form. Ooh. Did I just delete everything? I think I did. That would be really bad. Okay. Yeah, let's Control Z. It'll save your life. And let's go ahead and drop another save down there. Oof. Man, that would have been rough. Anyway, as I was saying, Stone Golem has immutable form. The golem is immune to any spell or effect that would alter its form. So you can't like turn it into a smaller creature or a different kind of creature or something like that. Magic resistance, advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. And the golem's weapon attacks are magical. So, yeah, interesting. And it looks like they can cast slow as an action, which is kind of interesting. Which I think that works with this design with a kind of shield and like some kind of large weapon like a sword, like a great sword or a shield that's wielded, or a great sword or a spear that's wielded kind of like one-handed. So I kind of like where she's at. I don't mind this, per se. Like, I just want to keep going with this headdress. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Kind of like this. Oh, maybe that's too much. I don't know. How did I have it before? I had it kind of like this. We'll drop those. So they look like eyes. Too much. And I think we'd want the face to be kind of like wider. I could even... I don't know if this is a great idea, but we're going to test out the transform tools. I think we want distort. No, that is not really one. No, never mind. That's the wrong one. It's mesh transformation. Okay. This is maybe not the best way to do this, but I do just want to play around with some of these tools. That's one of those things, another kind of goal of this little challenge is to improve my workflows a little bit. Yeah, I think moving her head a little bit forward, making it more imposing, that makes sense to me. But anyway, so one thing that I was playing around with the Mummy Lord was kind of like, so flatting colors, not the most fun, not a terribly enjoyable part of the process, especially when you're kind of like, you gotta kind of think through like what colors you even want in the first place. Not my favorite. So finding ways to do that faster has been nice. Because it's not good to try and do everything faster, but if there are, little technical tricks that you can use that don't actually affect the quality of the piece ultimately, or even improve it, you should absolutely go for those things. If it's faster and better, well, I guess a no-brainer, right? If the results are the better or the same and you just did it with less time and less hassle, absolutely. You don't have to suffer for your art. That's not a requirement. It's not a requirement. It's just a... it's just a likely outcome. It's just like, oh yeah, you might as well bet on suffering. No, I'm kidding. Suffering is mostly outside of the art part of it. The actual art should be fun. Which is why we shouldn't let the robots do it, right? Why would we want the robots to be enjoying themselves for us? Okay, now I'm just picking away at this helmet thing. I actually think I'm satisfied enough with this as a sketch that I could keep sketching on top of. Maybe make some copies of this and do some different design elements on top of that. But I think I'm going to call the stream for today, and we'll go ahead and leave it at that. If anyone does happen to ever watch this video, thank you for doing so. Like and subscribe, all that fun stuff. And hopefully, see you in the next one when we take on a different character. I don't know if I'm going to be doing one of these every single day. I'll probably take like Sunday off or something. And I definitely will have to take a few days off this month anyway from streaming. So now I'm getting kind of lost in the sauce again. Anyway, that'll be all for today. Thank you for coming along in this ride to get this design started in this Stone Golem, which I gotta say is just looking like a lady for the most part. And I know I said earlier I don't want to take that fix it in post mentality, but I think a lot of the kind of like stone elements of this lovely lady are going to come in during the kind of like rendering process, and maybe we'll do something to like step up her little die-ass here, her pedestal, her platform, to make it abundantly clear that she is made of stone. All right. Well, that's all there is to it. Let's save that. Can't let that go unsaved. Alrighty. Thanks for tagging along. Take care, folks. Bye.